Session A, freemium, free versus pay, the conundrum of content monetization, addressing the economics of abundance. If that's not the panel you came for, then you're in the wrong room. And I'm Sean Gold, your moderator. I'm former CMO of MySpace and now CEO of a company called Cocodot, sort of an evolution in online invitations and communication around life stage events. So we're going to talk about the freemium model today. The freemium model is getting a lot of publicity. It applies to monetization of content like print, video, music, monetization of services, online dating, and it's been a very popular software monetization tool as well. I got to give some props to Fred Wilson because he's sort of credited with coming up with the term, or he solicited the term from someone he knows, but he's the guy who is on Wikipedia. So he says, give your service away for free, possibly ad-supported, but maybe not. Acquire a lot of customers very efficiently through word of mouth, referral networks, organic search marketing, and then offer premium-priced, value-added services or an enhanced version of your service to your customer base. So clearly, this is nothing new. You got a 30-day trial when you bought your Ronco Pocket Fisherman. You leaf through magazines at the newsstand before you buy them. I lived with my wife for a year before I asked her to marry me. Freemium. But what's new is, and what we're going to focus on today specifically, is charging for things that were previously free, which is a lot harder. And even with that, we're going to focus on the hardest problem, which Victor Harwood really wanted to focus on, which was the monetization of text-based media and news. So we've assembled really some top experts in the monetization of print and text-based media on this panel. And today we're going to cover what content people will actually pay for, when and in what environment they're willing to pay for it. And finally, if we have time, we'll cover new ways to exploit traditional media and text-based media brands in a digital environment. And with that, let me introduce the panelists. So my first panelist here is Richard Gingras, who is Chief Executive Officer of Salon.com. And incidentally, in 1995, he assembled the seed funding for Salon.com, so he's sort of come back to that property. Prior to joining Salon, he served as an advisor on media product strategy to the executive team at Google, a fine brand. Before that, he was founder and CEO of Goodmail Systems. And in Web 1.0, he was Senior Vice President and GM of Excited Home consumer portal. Great background. Number two is Eduardo Hauser. He's the founder and chief executive of Daily Me. Daily Me is a company focused on developing and deploying news technology. The company is a pioneer in the field of dynamic personalization. Daily Me currently tracks more than 13 million news consumers for purposes of displaying personalized recommendations. Prior to that, Eduardo was founder and executive vice president of America Online's Latin America division. He also serves on the National Board of Directors of National Public Radio, which I think is maybe one of your more interesting accolades there.
So I might argue it's the only one.
Next we have Steve Canappa, who's General Manager of IBM's Global Media and Entertainment Division. He's been with IBM for 27 years, so I've just learned. Steve's responsible for delivering innovative solutions to clients involved in business of entertainment, broadcast, online cable, publishing, satellite, sports, and advertising. His group is famous for publishing a lot of reports that I personally have stolen a lot of material from. The end of advertising as we know it, the end of TV as we know it. And I think he has some new research today he wants to share. Then we have Greg Coleman, who's Chief Revenue Officer of the Huffington Post. Prior to that, he was president of AOL's Platform A. He was EVP of Global Sales at Yahoo. Greg also spent 11 years at Reader's Digest as Senior Vice President of Reader's Digest Association and president of U.S. Magazines. So his background, obviously, some of you may or may not know that Reader's Digest is really kind of a hardcore direct marketing company. So his background in direct marketing with his ad-based background with the Huffington Post now makes him a pretty interesting panelist. And then lastly, we have Meryl Brown at the end, who's Chief Strategist for Press Plus, a service of journalism online. Meryl served as Senior Vice President of Real Networks, helped launch MSNBC.com as the first editor-in-chief. He has a bunch of jobs in journalism over his career. Journalism online is pretty interesting, very, very, very relevant. They're probably one of the foremost companies pushing freemium in print forward. It's co-founded by Steve Brill, Gordon Krovitz, former publisher of the Wall Street Journal, Leo Hindry. They say they are pioneering the effort to make the transition to a paid model successful for publishers and easy for readers. So with that, let me get into the first question, which I have to ask, which is, will online advertising revenue alone sustain a robust independent journalism at newspapers, magazines, or even online websites? Do we need to have this panel? Anybody can take from me. Let's actually go to Greg.
Okay. Could you ask the question again?
Sure. Well, for the folks out there on the web, will online advertising revenue alone sustain a robust independent journalism at newspapers, magazines, and even online-only websites? Do you think that's enough?
So there are a number of ways to go about answering that question. And you talked a little bit about my background in direct marketing. One of the realities of the marketplace that's going on right now is the fact, while there are very many well-intended internet publishers that feel that they deserve to get money from the consumer and should get money from the consumer, the fact of the matter is that I would say less than 5% of those publishers are equipped on the back end with the appropriate direct marketing skill set, teams, science, thoughts around how you can actually bring a subscriber in. It is not an easy thing, and it is a very expensive thing to staff up and to create a direct marketing machine. So I have lots of my friends, and I have lots of experience. When I was at Yahoo, we created a service called Platinum. And Platinum was all this great internet content, and I screamed at the top of my lungs that we needed this internal direct marketing team in order to be able to harness that revenue. It fell flat on its face because we weren't equipped on the back end. I look at, I'm from Long Island. One of my favorite newspapers is Newsday Magazine. Newsday Magazine I read certainly every weekend anyway, now that I live in the city. And they just developed a new website. They spent $4 million on their new website, and this is public information. And after 3 months, they had a total of 35 subscribers that's not 3,500, 35 subscribers to their magazine, to the newspaper. And
that's a little misleading, Greg, and you know it.
I don't know that.
Well, because they have 100% distribution of people already getting it from cable because it's on their Cablevision subscription. So that's not really a good data point about whether subscription can work or not.
So at any rate, it's a data point that I was given that I found interesting. If you don't find it interesting, it probably is valid to a point. But the most important issue, I think, starting here is, are the publishers equipped with the direct marketing expertise and team and investment to be able to get the money? That's the point I wanted to make.
How about Richard? You have some thoughts on this?
Sure. I've spent pretty much the last year redesigning virtually everything about Salon, from the product to the organization to the business model. In so doing, we've cut expenses by 1/3 and managed to increase the audience by 20%. So, the lines are starting to go in the right direction. But as far as the revenue model is concerned, Frankly, if advertising is not ongoing a substantial and majority portion of the revenue stream, then I think it's going to be a very, very, very difficult landscape for those who produce high-quality, quote, capitalized content. Salon, as some folks might know, actually has had premium subscriptions for about 8 years. It was not originally, when they started it, it was gated content. But it didn't work. We do still derive about 15% of our revenue from premium subscriptions, but it's not a gated content model. It's a support model. It's a model where some folks prefer not to have advertising and will pay us $45 a year for the privilege. So on the one hand, I do believe that we have to explore other legs of the revenue stool. Whether it's the kind of premium subscriptions I talk about here, whether there are other niche upsell premium subscriptions we might be able to get into, or whether it's the e-commerce opportunity that we have been exploring as well, we have to do that. But I, for one, I think I probably side close to Greg on this. I think folks who feel that premium subscriptions for consumer media are a likely substantial part of the revenue stream, I think, frankly, are dreaming. I don't think there's any evidence to support it. And it's primarily this. Everyone sort of points to the Wall Street Journal as a comparative, but it's not an appropriate comparative to mainstream media, simply because we have a highly commoditized environment out there, and it's very hard to convince anyone that the value is such that I will pay to get it. Wall Street Journal, business value, perceived to be high value business content paid for by business people who write it off. That's a very, very different thing from your average metropolitan newspaper. So again, I'm not saying one shouldn't explore areas in that regard, but to the extent that anyone sort of bases their future or a large part of their revenue model on the notion of premium subscriptions for gated content, I think they're wrong.
Let's go to Merrill.
So despite my awkward needling of Greg a minute ago, I agree with everything else he said, because the challenge of doing subscriptions right for publishers who have limited experience with it online is significant, which is why our company, Journalism Online, has spent close to a year and a significant amount of capital creating technology designed for publishers to try to solve this problem. So we have publisher affiliates representing 1,300 publications or so. Each one of them is very committed to this. Despite some reticence in an earlier panel you heard from a group of news executives about subscriptions, every one of them is contemplating a paid strategy of one kind or another, as is every major publisher in the world. I spoke on this topic at a conference in Berlin last week with the leading magazine publishers from all across the world, from every continent. Each one of them is thinking about more effective ways at driving subscription revenue from the web. So we're part of a revolution here, not just in the McGraw-Hill building, but that's worldwide, and it's going to take that to make this happen. Just as a revolution in how we watch television changed the business model of television. We all write very large checks to our cable operators. In 1975, we couldn't have imagined writing the checks we write today to them. It's been a long process, but to the original question from our moderator, there wouldn't be a cable news industry today if it were not for consumers in writing their checks to their cable operators helping make that happen.
So what was the opportunity other than access to content that made people pay for cable? I mean, a lot of it was people couldn't get it. Couldn't get great signal, right?
That was the initial, yes, of course, a small number of people who had to have it, just like a small number of people have to have the Wall Street Journal online today, were the impetus for creating a larger industry, and that's the same phenomena that's at play here.
I was going to say, I think the answer to your question is two words: it depends. It depends what market you're in around the world. It depends what content you're talking about, and it depends what moment in time and what device. In addition to the studies that you mentioned, end of advertising, beyond advertising, et cetera. And by the way, if you haven't seen those, they're available on our website, ibm.com, and they're free, so the price is right. But as part of what we've been doing in analyzing the trends in the marketplaces, we've been doing these surveys with consumers around the world and looking at differences in geographies and adoption rates. And since you wanted to start with traditional media, I thought I'd mention just a couple recent statistics. We're about to publish another set of findings, but In '07, when we asked folks about how they were adopting online newspapers, 18% said that they were regularly using online newspapers. And as we flash forward to today, 57%, 2 years later, are now used to going to a site for an online newspaper, and about 40% regularly do that. Magazines, it's about 30%, so it's trailing behind. But so the point is, there's changes in usage patterns that are happening every day, and those changes kind of give us the opportunity, I think, to leverage a bigger and bigger demographic. But there are differences. In our most recent study, 18 to 24-year-olds, usage has actually gone down for the first time, from 63% to 57%. So we're starting to see a tell-off, this was on the newspaper usage, a tell-off in newer, younger demographics as they come. So they're moving to other places for sources of news. So an example, where do they go? Where those who search digitally now are as likely as not to just go to Google and look at the headlines they get for a particular title and go no further. So not only is different content available, but the way folks are using it, depending on demographic, really influences what they're willing to do. And I can come back later as we talk and give you some statistics about what they're willing to pay for.
Eduardo, do you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, I think so far the question, Sean, I want to be mindful of the structure you have because of the discussion, because I think you came up with a very good one. The question was, is advertising sufficient to fund sort of the model as we know it? And I would argue that with the information we have at hand currently, there will be very few people that will be able to survive solely on that. I will, at times, if you ask me questions, I'm going to run the risk of generalizing and simplifying because this is complex and no situation is equal. But my answer to that specific question would be no, based on the information we have at hand.
Okay. So let's
if I could, I maybe just a sort of a helpful and rule of thumb that at least I've devised, because I agree with that. I do think that if you're talking about again, original content publications surviving on advertising, I think they're all going to have to be fairly large to pull that off. My own internal math is if I look at it on a cost of goods calculation, presuming the kind of average CPMs we're seeing today in the ad market, $6 today, where it was $8 a year ago, and who knows where it'll be next year. That basically means that for my cost of goods calculation on a content head count, someone who's creating content in some fashion or another, they're going to be generating like 3-4 million page views a month on average. Not that individual, but on average. That's a lot of traffic, which really says you're talking about, top end of the torso and on up to make that work.
Can I make a quick comment on this cost of goods point? Because I mentioned other markets, I'll be short, but in Japan, as an example, where they have newspapers that are organized by region, one of the projects we did for them, acquisition cost is probably next to pulp is the highest line item in the budget. So we did a content share architecture for them to allow them to share stories across properties where they only had marginal overlap between the properties, the mastheads in the various regions. And they were able to dramatically drive down the cost of acquisition, which then makes business models that otherwise would be unaffordable become affordable. And I think, so when you think about the revenue side of the equation and the advertising side of the equation, you have to think also about the input side, which is how is it that we're going to drive down the unit cost of production so that we can make these models affordable in new distribution mechanisms.
Can I make a quick reflection on the revenue side? I agree with that. But I think Richard also made a comment that's very important. In order to get to that $6 CPM, what kind of organization do you have to be? And the truth is that the majority of the industry that is out there selling ads is doing so indirectly, the majority, which means that you're really not going to get to the $6 CPM. So for those that are not directly in the business, I would just caution that those are high numbers by some measures. And there aren't a lot of people that can get away with it. Without an infrastructure, organization, scale, so getting there is harder than it sounds.
So let me also add this. I've been 5 months now at the Huffington Post, and I would never have joined believing that we could make a real splash in the advertising market. And by the way, that's all we're focusing on. We don't have a skunk's work project trying to get revenue from our users. I would never have joined if I didn't believe that scale was going to be there. And I think to the point that was just made, for smaller publishers that are trying to make a go of it purely from advertising, that's going to be very difficult. And so I agree 100% with that.
Let's go. I'm going to go to Meryl. So let's assume that people will pay for content. What do you think they're willing to pay for, and what won't they pay for? what's the content that they'll sell. And we can talk about how they'll pay in a minute. I'm just trying to, what is the content in the text-based media that, is it local, is it sports, is it whatever?
Well, obviously, there's a scarcity assumption that has to be in all that. They won't pay for commoditized headlines. They won't pay for baseball scores. They shouldn't be paying for stock quotes. And they shouldn't be paying for coverage of what President Obama said about health care yesterday. But they will pay for very specialized things. They will pay for deep coverage of their favorite sports teams, college or pro. They will pay for franchise content that only local newspapers have in their communities. They will pay for stuff that is deep and rich and created in packaged ways for them about ease of use. They will pay for devices, we see that in mobile already. They will pay for devices that offer them convenience, and we see the beginnings of those models emerging already.
So let me quote Arianna Huffington on that note. People will pay for only specialized financial information and very kinky sex, in terms of,
Yeah.
that was a joke you were supposed
How
to
very?
No,
Where's the bar for very?
what do we know? We know they'll pay for fantasy sports data.
Right.
We know they'll pay for specialized financial information. We know they'll pay for, to your last comment, some live show of the Sports Illustrated swimsuit models. But they won't pay for local news content, or at least not in any significant numbers to justify the cost of creating that content. I think, again, I think that's one of the scenarios that people toss around that I think is, I want the dope they're smoking.
That's the same mindset that said they never pay for television.
Here's the difference. Here's the difference. Because when I say not television, this is all about distribution control. And the one thing that we miss with the internet, all these discussions, right? What killed the newspaper model? It wasn't Google. It was the breaking of the distribution model that the internet represents. Simply and totally that, and the fact that we have this long tail of information that's out there in highly commoditized areas. Television, completely different ballgame. It controlled distribution that for large periods of time I had to access to get to it. But even there, notice what's going on with the younger generation of folks who are getting broadband subscriptions by one fashion or another and are not subscribing to cable programming. So we're beginning to see some disruption in TV as well. So I just don't think that model holds.
There is currently no long tail about local news. There is only one credible ongoing place to read about potholes, the Board of Education, the airplane that went down in the middle of town, so on and so forth. Those people have monopoly power still, even though it's deteriorating as their products deteriorate, in their local markets. And if they market it smartly to their most engaged users, they have a chance to add at least incremental revenue.
But I guess, Merrill and I like to have these debates. We like each other, but we like to argue across panels.
We're glad we do know opposite ends.
Here's the unfortunate, and I spent, with Salon and at Google, I was trying to look at, well, what could we do in the local space? Because clearly I'd love that geocoded data, but I won't spend a dime investing in content to get that geocoded data for two reasons. One is we can talk all we want about the woeful potential lack of city council hearing coverage, but no one read it. Potholes, no one reads it. Ain't going to pay for it. And the other unfortunate thing about local content, I think there are real challenges there, but we have now gotten to the point where there is a complete disconnect between local ad revenues and local content, right? I was talking to someone the other day who was starting a local content site and who was going out and talking to local car dealers to see how they could help him out. There is zero relationship between the car buying process and local content. Ages ago, I'd go to the classifieds on Saturday to buy a car for my daughter. Now that is completely out of the equation. Right? It's an entirely different process.
Josh Resnick in the previous panel from Gannett went on and on and on about the power of his local franchises. The Gannett company believes that. Some people on this panel, frankly including me, might be a little cynical about the state of those franchises, but they still exist and they still have monopoly power in a shrinking number of ad categories, and certainly in local content creation.
But lots of that is predicated on relationships that they have in that local market. And as their children are finishing college and are used to the internet, those are going to break down very fast, as have the pure distribution of the newspapers to convey those messages. So if you talk to any of the large marketers, whether it's a Target or a Walmart, one of the major strategies that they have to figure out is, as newspapers are shrinking, those Sunday flyers and the FSIs that they're running, they don't have the opportunity to get it out as much. So therefore, they are forced now to start thinking about digital distribution of something that was once a very local, really important revenue stream for them.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, which is less about whether or not we can debate they have a monopoly, but what they're doing with their local presence. And are they using their local presence in a way to differentiate the way they get content to a set of users or subscribers, however they migrate them through some business model. And if they're not doing something to provide a more compelling experience than you get from flipping pages, then they're going to lose that audience.
Yes, and just to be clear, our emphasis and my personal emphasis is about product development, because if they believe that the existing legacy newspaper, clearly a deteriorating product from a qualitative point of view, is going to be the answer in these local market cases, they're wrong, and most publishers get that this is about things like Josh was talking about earlier, developing the mom's product in town, packaging content effectively, doing new, different, and more targeted things, because I agree with Richard to the extent that the newspaper as it exists today in a rapidly deteriorating state probably is going to be hard-pressed to get people in significant numbers to subscribe to it online.
Eduardo, what's your thought?
Well, two quick references. One's a data point and another one's just a thought. So the title of the panel addresses the economics of abundance, right? And I'm not an economics major, but what makes me optimistic about this market is that there's a lot of supply and there's a lot of demand. And the problem is that there have to be some organizational principles for the market to improve in efficiency and improve in transparency. So when we try to take binary approaches that said, people will pay or people won't pay, my response is some people will pay for some. And I'm sure that all of us have views on what the sum qualifier is in both cases. So for example, I can tell you that in a lot of the sites that we work for, more than 80% of the pages are generated by less than 15% of its audience. Mm-hmm. That means that there's a very strong group of loyalists inside the publication that probably will pay. Now, how much and for what? That's a discussion that, again, to Meryl's point, has to do with product development. What they will pay for, this is probably going to be the only reference that you'll hear me make to NPR, because I don't like to speak on behalf of a company, but NPR is a great example of content that people pay for. Now, they pay for in a less traditional way than we would be debating here, but that would be a good point of reference.
What about, no one's really mentioned high-profile, unique columnists, like the New York Times or the Post, where, do you think that people are not going to be willing to pay for, great journalists or journalism? And if they are, do you reward these journalism? Do you share revenue with the journalists, and do you bonus them based on page views?
I don't think we're going to have a good answer to that question anytime soon, because the American media industry focused on the New York Times experiment of putting its columnists behind a paid wall, abandoned it, not necessarily because it didn't make financial sense, but because they felt that having those columnists, Tom Friedman, et cetera, behind that wall took them out of the larger web discussion. So you raise a good question, but I think we're going to have rotten answers to it for the next 5 years.
Yeah, and to these columnists, it's not all about money. They want the pipe. They want to reach a lot of people. Put them behind the paywall where they lose 90% of their voice. Right. They're gone. They're going to go.
Book sales.
There goes their book sales.
Do you, just Huffington Post, have you looked at or thought about bonusing writers based on page views?
No, we have an editorial team of about 50 people. We have 110 people in the whole company, and we're generating 23 million unique visitors. So in terms of bonusing, we have, and we take grief for it, but it's a wonderful model, because we do have a voice, and we have a large voice with reaching that many people. The people that blog for us are ecstatic about being able to reach the kind of audience that we have. So we don't have, we have this unusual business model where most of the people that write for us, we don't pay. And it's a pretty good model.
What was that percent again?
I'm sorry?
The percent, what was that percent? You said what percent of people you don't pay? What was the?
Well, we pay 0% of our blog, we pay our bloggers nothing. So that's a pretty good percentage on a rev share basis.
And then, so let's talk about pricing strategy a little bit. So There's a great book I was reading called Predictably Irrational. Anybody seen that book? It's really entertaining. It's like Freakonomics for pricing. And they start off the book saying, they have this example of The Economist on offer online where the print-only version is $125. The digital version is $59. Then they also have the print and digital together for $125. And in that scenario, 89% of the people take print and digital together. When they take away the print-only version and just have digital 59, print and digital 125, 69% of the people take the digital only. So in charging for, and then this guy is pushing a movement of behavioral economics, how economics is short-sighted in that relative value and perception of value is really important. So in that, under that premise, like, what do you think the model, what model do you think is going to work? Is it going to be subscription? Is it going to be per use fees, a combination?
It depends, but I think there's some interesting things happening in business model evolution. I mean, one of the underlying problems is most of traditional physical media distribution was done through business-to-business partners, and so media companies really didn't learn anything about their audience or their subscribers, or audiences, I guess I should say, readers, and therefore couldn't exploit the fact that they already had a relationship, and so along comes digital, and we have a different paradigm here. We did a project with Time. I don't know if anyone's been on the MagHound site, if you've seen that. It's an example in the magazine world of an interesting approach to a new business model. Somewhere between newsstand price and a subscription price, they thought there's a lot of ground in between. So what if we provided a subscription-based service to our consumers, and a reader who is an avid boarder, I'll make this up, he surfs in the summer and skis in the winter, but would like to have a single subscription that allows them to get a different magazine property in the summer than the winter. What if we gave them something in between those two ends of the spectrum as they existed before, give them a subscription service, but make the content tailored to, in that example, the time of year or what their interest was at that point in time. And they do that today. So they've, in cable network fashion, they've aggregated a bunch of properties. They've thrown a new subscription model over it, and they've given more flexibility to the subscriber to pick which content they actually read at what point in time. Kind of like what Netflix did to the physical DVD business. So I think, examples like that start to show how you can blend models in a way that provides higher value to a targeted audience.
But we also have examples of consumers are pretty hard to change the way they operate. At AOL, for example, a significant number of the people that subscribe to the AOL service don't need it. They're getting broadband. They don't need it. Maybe they get security or something. And getting people to switch to say you don't really need to send that check in for whatever it is per month is still baffling. And then really good publications that are trying to get people to subscribe can't do it. So it's the consumer is really fickle around what they pay for and what they don't pay for.
And let's face it, let's face it, we have really inadequate data about all this. And one of the journalism online challenges is just to get people in the marketplace experimenting. Because other than speculative data or research data that we're hearing from IBM and other consulting firms, the amount of data we have in the United States about people's predilections to pay is very, very, very limited. And the experiments have been very limited. Green Bay Packers in Milwaukee, the guy in Newport News, Virginia, the guy in Little Rock, Arkansas. There are a couple of places, and it's a single-digit number, that are really trying robust experiments today.
So if you look at the magazine industry today, and it's one we're not here to really talk about, but the difficulties that the magazine industry at large is having in maintaining any kind of revenue from subscription revenue, it's really gone away. I mean, when I first got into the business, magazine subscription revenue was at least 50%. Right now, maybe 10 with most of them. So it's a sea change that's going on across all medium right now.
I'm sorry, I'll let you go first.
No, I was, so your question was about the pricing model, and what I would argue is that for a pricing model, to have an effective form of predicting the pricing model, there is one crucial element that we need to address, and it's the issue of relevance, is how do you create relevance so that you actually have price flexibility? If you have a largely irrelevant product, then I think the discussion of pricing points is largely superfluous.
Well, how do you mean relevant?
Perfect. So to Meryl's point, I think data, this conference, it's kind of interesting. I believe that for the next few cycles, there will be an increasing amount of discussion around data. I mean, technology, we all throw in the word technology, and technology is a great way to fix big problems in a repetitive way. But I believe that in a few cycles, there's going to be a lot of conversation about data, because data will inform us in ways that we don't currently have. And if you look at, if you guys haven't picked up the previous issue of The Economist, there's 18 pages of data analysis that is really unreal. It's, there's going to be a sea change in a lot of this, is in space exploration and undersea exploration. And to the extent that the news industry can benefit from garnering more data, we will have information to create more relevant products. And when you've created a more relevant product, then you can start to, arguing about price points, and not until then.
Unfortunately, the environment right now to take advantage of that data is deteriorating as rapidly as the products we're describing are deteriorating. Our conversations, or many conversations I have in my consulting life with Journalism Online and others, I'm having worse conversations or less interesting conversations with traditional media companies about digital products, because the digital people seem to be disappearing before my very eyes. They're going to work for digital companies. They're exiting legacy media. The traditional media executive bunch believes they now get digital because they can talk about page views, or as one executive at a large publishing company said to me the other day, well, I was online today. What are you talking about? When I was trying to, you know. So hopefully all this data we're about to get about behavior will be assessed by very smart, very experienced people, but it's getting a little scary in terms of media companies being able to do so.
Let's just say one of the things, a project to that point that we've been working on in the journalistic world is about making a lot of the issue, I think, gets to the heart of the quality of the content, or how unique is the content that gets produced. And when journalists are using kind of traditional tooling to create their work product, they're almost at a disadvantage because now there's N+1 potential journalists in the world that could blog or that can capture content anywhere it happens to happen, and they can publish it themselves in some form. So I think one of the things we're working on is helping traditional media firms use 21st century tooling. So whether that's semantic web search, or whether that's really deep algorithmic analysis of looking for relationships between people and events and places and things, so that you can come up with unique story angles on how you're going to cover a particular topic. I think that is where the market needs to move, because if we don't enable the folks that are creating the content to have access to information in insightful ways, then they can't distinguish themselves from this clutter of content that's being put in all these distribution sources.
Here's my concern, and particularly I think for traditional publishers. Fair point. I think we can always benefit from more data. However, I certainly haven't seen any data, and one of the things at Google was I just got buried in data. But I haven't seen any data to really support, outside of, again, niches that we've talked about, a consumer demand strong enough to pay for general consumer content, local content. And my concern is this, and same thing when people start thinking about these new devices. I hear traditional publishers getting all hot and sweaty for the iPad, like it was, got to take another pull on the crack pipe to get me back to my traditional model. It's crazy. It's crazy. There is no logic there. Waste of time. And frankly, even if somehow the stars misaligned in some way that I can't see, and there was some market on the iPad, even though there's a browser there, by the way, for specialized publications for pay, then you basically just swap the troubles of the internet for Steve Jobs being your bitch. So or is it the other way around? But here's my concern. All glibness aside, I think it's a huge distraction, because for the most part, I think where we really need to focus our efforts is in completely redesigning our media, completely redesigning the structures of our organizations, completely redesigning how we do things, completely redesigning how we approach our audiences and seek those audiences and engage those audiences in a distribution and social media landscape that's hugely different from what it was even 3 years ago. Redesigning workflows so that expensive $80,000 headcount you got writing really brilliant original material is actually getting more out of it than just one article.
Right.
Redesigning how we organize our sites and manage SEO in a good white-hatted way such we take full advantage of getting our content out there as answers to the questions that people are seeking when they go to Google. All of those things require a lot of effort, and particularly for traditional organizations where you've got cultures to change, it's not insignificant. And so when I hear those organizations, or even in my own, because Solano was around long enough that it got kind of embedded in its culture, was people are seeking somehow a solution to a problem other than looking inward and seeing what they need to do to make their properties work. And it's challenging enough, by the way, even if you do all of that right. So
I completely agree. And one of the difficulties that companies have to face is the fact that most legacy media brands, whether they be digital or offline, are not capable to really morph the way that they need to morph in this world. I didn't create the Huffington Post. I started to work there. There's no newspaper company in the world that could ever have thought to do what this company has done. It's not a knock on them, but the innovation that's required to make the changes that was just being discussed are generally not going to come from people that are trying to hold on to that last nickel of this revenue or that revenue. And very few are willing to just let go and get off of planet Krypton before it blows up. Very few people are willing to do that. And I think that's going to be a conundrum that we're going to watch. Yep. Innovation won't take place inside.
Richard,
the iPad is the fatal distraction.
By the way, you guys are excellent panelists.
Richard, maybe with Steve directly in the middle of us, we might actually be able to add a data point or two to the discussion. Actually, the data is, I think, moving in encouraging ways about people being willing to pay, right. And I think the numbers are not trivial. And I think the basic number in the United States is somewhere in the 20s, people saying they're willing to pay for news. Now, if Janet and Arthur can get 20% of their frequent users to pay them, that would be a pretty good thing, and any large publication in this country that could do that in a metered way with their most frequent users, I think will be taking the first step in the revolution we're describing.
And I would say that it's, once again, it depends, because a lot of folks in a web environment now have somewhat been trained to the notion that they don't have to pay. And along comes the iPad, or along comes mobile, and I think there's an opportunity to start fresh with some models where the psychology is that you do pay. And the other point I was going to make to this iPad comment, because I think it's a very important point, and I'm going to draw from the video world for a second, because I think if you look across segments of the industry, you can actually learn some things that can be applied. But we do all the major, not all of, but many of the major sporting events around the world online. So US Open, Wimbledon, Ryder Cup, Masters, Australian Open, etc. And when we do Wimbledon now, as an example, if you want to watch the national television feed and see what some programming exec decides they want to show you as far as which court at Wimbledon, you can do that, and you can have a lean-back experience. If you want to go online, though, while we're producing the fortnight of Wimbledon, you can pick which court you want to watch. So if you're a fan of a particular athlete, for whatever reason, you have that choice. You become your own programmer. But more important, and that's interesting, and you get full television quality video over the web now, and you can watch that, and it allows Wimbledon to sell advertising and sponsorship and commerce and all kinds of things around that, social networking, whatever they want to add to that experience. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, what we've been doing recently is we've been integrating data feeds into that video. So not only can I pick which court I want to watch at what time and switch back and forth as I choose, but I can, while I'm watching on the screen, pull down data about the players or what's happening on other courts or historical information, or there's a whole bunch of choices. So now I become my own director too, as far as what information is being provided to me, overlaid on that screen at what time. And I think the difference is we're using the power of the technology to differentiate and customize and tailor that user experience. And by the way, along the line, capture a ton of data about what their preferences are, what their behaviors are, what their, the way they like to consume, the way they move through an experience. All of that kind of information, I think, informs the way that that content is then provided. And when I think of something like the iPad, not it in particular, and I think of a publisher, it is a wonderful opportunity to change that experience and differentiate that experience from what they might get on some other technology. And I think that's where we see the market going.
Let me make 2 comments, if you don't mind, to that effect.
Sure.
So one is, there are 2 things that would happen concurrent with this model gaining a little bit of traction from where I sit. One is that the content will get unbundled, inevitably. And again, in making references to other industries, and I know we reference the music industry ever and ever again, but I want to give you a data point. So up until February of 2009, iTunes had sold 6 billion songs, if I'm correct. Between February of 2009 and February of 2010, iTunes had sold 10 billion songs, which means that in a period of 1 year, they sold 4 billion songs more than they had sold in the entire history. When you apply that to the news industry, it's very scary. But what iTunes was able to do, and I think is really telling, is just to create a much larger market. And the people who are suffering in that process are the people that were using old organizational principles. And it's the music publisher. When you take that to the news industry, the organizational principles that we came from, the one that we used to pay to get delivered to the home, were based on 3 things: editorial knowledge, geographical knowledge, and demographic knowledge. And unless you identify the new organizational principles of how do you disaggregate that content and aggregate it again, in a way that it's valuable to one, then you'll be able to charge for that. The airline industry, and last reference, is another thing. There was an interesting article comparing American Airlines to the New York Times a couple of days ago that said American Airlines was able to get away with essentially charging you for your bags for a premium seat and things like that, because a couple of things happen together. A large player did it well in the context when consumers knew that it was inevitable, and the industry followed.
Let me switch a little bit. I want to talk about coffee for a second. I could really use a cup of coffee. So I want to talk about price anchoring. So the anchor now is free, and the anchor for coffee, when Dunkin' Donuts was around, was whatever the price was, and then Starbucks came in and they changed the experience of coffee.
Right. And
so now I don't even take my free coffee at the office. I go pay whatever, $30 for a cup of coffee at Starbucks. So do we need to make the consumption experience different to charge for content? Is the Apple iPad going to save everything? Or things like that?
I find the iPod discussions rather puzzling because there's nothing technologically different there. I mean, there is nothing stopping anyone, from creating these. I've seen folks with these very nice prototypes of, quotes, next generation content publications that they'd put on the iPad. All of these things are things that you could do on a computer and have been able to do on a computer for years. People have been doing them with Air for the last several years. They don't get used.
Right.
They don't get used. Right? Because our consumption has become so web-oriented, and particularly if you look at the generational interaction with content, it is so web-oriented that I frankly find it hard to imagine how an experience on the iPad can be so compellingly different that I will give up the web browser that's one click away on the iPad and consume my content through this slick new app that I pay for. Again, I just have a hard time getting there. As I've said, I agree that we clearly have to look for alternate revenue streams and not just rely on advertising. But again, looking at the traditional media companies, there is such a delta in the business models between traditional and online that it's really scary. I like to talk a lot about cost of goods. I kind of just got to get this down to numbers. My current cost per 1,000 page views is about $6. My guess is Greg's about $1. The New York Times, my back-of-the-envelope calculation, and I was told that this was conservative, is in excess of $65. And that's just taking my rough assessment of their cost of goods, right? I'm not talking about their printing trucks, the cost of editorial and anything associated with creating the digital product against their page views, and it's well beyond $60.
$60, what's the measurement of?
Per thousand page views. So, you know, and we're still talking CPMs out here today on average that are, you know, exponent less. So we're talking about really extremely different environments here.
Which reinforces the notion that we've got to get to work on figuring out subscriber-driven revenue streams. Or, to your first question, Mr. Moderator, the notion of traditional journalism surviving is imperiled. I think it's intuitive. I think it's logical. I think it's not really arguable. We got to get to work at this.
Let me see if there's a parallel here between your comment and cost of goods sold and a piece of information that I'll share. Unfortunately, I'm not at liberty to share the name of the publisher because it's confidential, but
by the way, my assessment of the New York Times was not privileged. It was my analysis based on publicly available data.
We work with a number of publishers, one of which is actually very well-known, large regional publisher that writes on a certain category, writes about 50 stories per day. The people, the loyalists to that website visit on average once per day. And when they come, they see 3 stories. I can assure you that within the 47 that they do not see, there is value. If we were finding a different base of amortizing that cost that Richard is talking about, then I think the equation would begin to change. That is the work I do. It's not intended as a plug, but the work that my company does is exactly try to build the connections between people, content assets, and other types of transactions that can get content viewed by more people in a more valuable way so that they generate more revenue. So to my earlier comment about the organizational principles, I don't think this is a binary discussion. I think we're going to have to test a lot of models, and there's no silver bullet. There isn't one model, you know, for a large group of individuals that is going to solve the industry's problem.
Anybody else comment on that? So as far as the iPad and mobile apps, people are used to paying for mobile apps now. Are they, you know, is this?
Actually, most mobile apps,
Free.
yeah. So I think the number is 17%.
And I think, to Greg's point, once again, I agree completely with Greg. I think that the iPad will expose the ineptitude and the marginal investment in real digital product development that weak publications have, and will make them look weaker and sink faster. So that's another call to action, I think.
That's a quotable quote.
Happy to deliver it.
You know, in all of this, oddly enough, I'm quite sanguine about the future of journalism. I don't worry about the future of journalism. I think it'd just be a very different landscape from one that we see today. And clearly the participation will be much longer tailed. I do think we're at least moving into a period where we're not going to have 75,000 full-time journalists making $100,000 a year. I think that economic element of the landscape will change dramatically. But I don't worry about it. I don't even worry about the future of investigative journalism, because the past of investigative journalism has always been based on the little guy, the I.F. Stone, working out of mainstream media, who discovers shit that ultimately mainstream media jumps on. I suspect we'll see that in spades in this environment.
We've seen how technology, I mean, to that point, look at the studio animation and effects business as an example, structural example. There, it used to be a DreamWorks or a Sony or, you know, whoever would create large buildings, fill them with very talented animators, and produce, you know, animation and effects content. And the reality is that's an expensive business model, especially when the technology kind of levels the playing field, and a very creative, talented animation or effects creator could be sitting anywhere in the world and be sending their work back and forth digitally. So what you saw was a disaggregation of you know, the content creation process, and a much stronger movement towards folks coming together around work product and then disaggregating, you know, onto the next event. And I think in the news environment, we're starting to see that happen. Where freelance is becoming increasingly important, and, you know, gets back to what's the individual's brand.
Where freelance is becoming free.
Yeah.
So I just want to go back. I want to go back to the earlier comment that I made. So we've talked about data, and data is so valuable. We talk about how content is served up to the user differently, more prominently in certain ways. But I will still stand firm on the point that until the publishing community understands the basics of direct marketing, you can have all of that stuff, but you can't reel a consumer in to pay for your product.
Is this like the rise of the subscription department in the organization? Now
Well, but I think some of these companies should really take a look at outsourcing, at least on a test basis, some of the things that they're doing. We've all read about the New York Times going behind the paywall in a year. That was also an interesting announcement. We're going to do it in a year. So what I would suggest, it would be really smart. There are a lot of really world-class direct marketers that some of this testing should be just outsourced to people that know it cold rather than build it inside of your own company at first.
Are you offering that, Merrill?
Yes, we absolutely are. Greg, I appreciate that because that is one of the things that is one of the things that Journalism Online, our company, is offering. We're offering deep analytics. We're offering to share across the industry, in some ways, anonymized data about what's working, what's not. We employ economic modelers and people with expertise in the direct marketing of news, and I couldn't agree more that left to figure this out on their own, it's less likely to have a positive net result.
After breaking my chops, I throw you a bone.
Yeah.
That's what a...
I was going to say, you know, Meredith is...
Meredith's a good example.
Meredith is an interesting example, I think, where they began to diversify and they got into marketing activities that they not only apply to their business, but they're now doing for fee for other folks.
Yeah.
And if you look at their
marketing companies and digital marketing companies.
Yeah, and if you look at their recent earnings, they're now getting a substantial piece of revenue out of taking the competencies that they built in that area and applying it to standard consumer products companies.
So Meredith, for their businesses, in case not everybody knows, they're in print publications, they own local television stations, and they've started to diversify with buying marketing companies.
I want to associate myself with Richard's comments too. I don't lament the death of crumbling, badly run media companies. The ones that are well run will succeed, I believe. The ones that are poorly run will fail. We have failing newspapers all around us right now. A lot of that sits at their doorstep. I sat through a panel yesterday in the audience where I heard nothing but legacy media complaints about what the internet has done to them. Like, progress has ruined our business. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to hear sometimes in that math.
Yeah.
So well-run publications will succeed, poorly run ones will fail, and we're about to see a blossoming of lots of new ones to take its place, and hopefully we'll all be a part of those new organizations. I'm on a variety of boards of startup organizations, including a citizen journalism company about which we raised $10 million to launch. There's also money to get these things off the ground. These guys just raised $20+ million. There's money to go do new things. There are opportunities to go do new things, but it's time to get about the business of doing so.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about, we have 15 minutes left. I'll take a couple questions. First, I want to talk about new revenue streams. So there's, we have classified, let's just talk about that to start. Is classified growing or dead, or what's happening in that space with the newspapers?
It's somebody else's space.
It's what?
I said it's somebody else's space, not theirs.
And then are advertisers going more aggressive on with the ad market being soft, everybody's running performance marketing, cost per acquisition, cost per sale, cost per registrant, and obviously they're going to be, as Greg says, they're going to need to be in that business for their own properties. Are you seeing much more of do you think this is a trend forever in the future in the digital space? Are you seeing more of that being done now?
Well, 2 points. In our last paper called Beyond Advertising, one of the points that we focused on was the combination of advertising and marketing activities. So you get the brand value of advertising, but you do it in much more context, or you do it in action-oriented ways, so that it's more either immersive with the content that's being offered, or there are offers provided that allow the reader to do something. And we're seeing that as a trend, and we're also seeing in some segments of the industry just embedded advertising. I mean, that's becoming increasingly important as well. So I think leading to commerce opportunities that can be bundled with that marketing experience I think that definition of what it means to be an advertiser is growing in importance. The other point I'd make is, the television business, the concept of a make good has been around for a very long time, which is if I can't draw the audience I expected, I have to somehow make that up. I think we're finding that as analytics, as information comes into the value chain, your ability to change the nature of the agreement you make with the folks that are buying your availability can allow you to optimize around things like make good, so that you get more efficient in how you're placing advertising, as an example.
I'd like to, although I recognize the importance of speaking about advertising, I'd like to think that in not too distant future, the notion will be one of transactions, of which advertising will be a part of. This may not be a perfect example, but two things that come to mind. So IBM invests money and publishes very valuable content, and yet you give it away for free as you've offered to this audience, because in the back end, there's a much more valuable relationship that can be created out of the people who consume it. In the panel previous to this, I asked a question because of the media companies that were represented. Bloomberg was obviously the more the one in better financial health, to the point that they can sponsor this conference, and they found a way to get the information. They found a way to get the information so close to the point of a major transaction, like a stock transaction, that they can charge $1,000 or more for Eternal every month. And I would argue that if we get better at associating professionally written quality content with more important transactions than just building a bridge through a 300 and 250 banner that takes you to another website, then the ecosystem in general will improve.
I think we're going to see lots of experimenting with clubs, broadly defined. It's not about analytics, but I've had conversations with Greg's colleagues at Huffington Post about the club that it's inevitable they're going to start. I mean, if I could be on a conference call every 2 weeks with Ariana and with Sam Stein and some of their stars and have exclusive rights to do that, I'd give them $10 a month in a heartbeat to do that. So we're going to see a lot of things that aren't exactly about subscription content, but are about other ways to build community and monetize it, develop over the next 2 years as well.
So the article is an ad campaign to sell other services in some sense, like expert networks?
Events, expert networks, deeper, richer content. There are timing issues in here that the club might have. So, I get my daily newspaper at midnight when it's first published on the web, but I can't see it again because or if I'm not a part of the club, I can't see it again until 6 p.m., even though it's refreshed throughout the day. There are lots of different experiments that people are actively talking about, and the club concept and membership is one of them.
Yeah, and you also have advertisers. You clearly have your low ball, very cheap bottom feeder advertisers. They're not going to go away till that inventory is shut off. But the good news on the other side is the number of advertisers today compared to a year ago or even 2 years ago that are looking for very deep partnership, deep alliances with the media companies is really on the rise. If you take a look at Apple, for example, Apple won't take anything for free. They don't really care about that. They're going deep into trying to extract the best relationships that you have with the best creative that they have. A friend of mine, Jim Spiros, and I were on a panel. He's the chief marketing officer of Fidelity. He just said that when it comes time for his review, his CEO doesn't ask him, well, how did you do on your CPMs? His answer is, how did you move sales? At the end of the day. So the quality orientation is still very vibrant, it's a bifurcated market right now, as is the low ball.
And then I was reading last, Martha Stewart made $75 million last quarter, or Q4, and 25% of that was from licensed product. Right. So obviously they built that brand, they're exploiting it in a lot of different ways. Let's take a question from the front row.
Do I have to do it on the mic, or?
Yeah, I'll repeat it if no one
can hear. Pretty loud. 2 comments or 2 questions. One, I wanted you guys to talk about the idea of newspapers as nonprofits and maybe creating a way with
they are, aren't they?
Excuse me. Yeah,
not deliberately, but
that's positive.
But in that model, maybe helping to support journalists, because one of the problems with citizen journalism, and I wanted you guys to comment on this, is the fact that a lot of writing on the internet is terrible. Badly edited, non-edited, and we have a problem with the one thing about newspapers and magazines and professional news organizations, they were at least channeling the work through editors. And now a lot of stuff is coming online that's non-edited. And I'm wondering whether this younger generation, and I happen to know, dealing with them, that a lot of them don't know the difference between good quality writing and bad quality writing, well edited and not well edited. And so I wonder whether the nonprofit model might create an environment for journalists to do things that might not have a direct relationship to a profit model. The other question is...
What's the first question?
The question is about talking about the nonprofit model and talking about the bad writing online that is happening because of citizen journalism and all this stuff that is not well edited, not well written, and no one's there to vet it like the old
Okay,
days.
so
I think there's two separate
The
things.
second question, and this is specifically directed to Greg, because I think it is a great model to take the bloggers.
Well, do you want to take two questions here, or I don't know
maybe the second
what you want.
question's better than the
We
first.
only have a couple more.
Well, I like the idea of having people taking the writers that may not be paid, but turning them into, moderating events and stuff. I think that's a good model for ways people can get paid.
I mean, I actually would question the fact that the quality of content out there is not good. I don't think that's correct. I mean, there's always, in any medium, there's a high percentage of wheat versus chaff. But the truth is, I mean, you see about the internet is we get more people writing and publishing than ever before in the history of mankind by huge degrees. A lot more chaff, yeah, but also a lot more wheat. From Salon's perspective, we've got a blogging community. It's about, 65,000 bloggers. They do about 500-600 articles a day, which is, it's not Salon branded content, but we do take the best of it to the point where now 20% of Salon's content actually are free contributions from the blogging community. And we wouldn't use it if it weren't good stuff. So I don't on its face accept the notion that the quality out there is poor. You got to pick and choose.
I was thinking more about the concept of citizen journalism.
So just, I mean, what I was thinking of as you were asking the question, the BBC jumped to my mind, which is if you think of journalistic integrity and quality of brand, I mean, the BBC would be pretty high up there in the world, I would think. They're a nonprofit organization, so whether you're profit or nonprofit isn't the core of the problem. They're facing the same challenges any other media company in the world is, in trying to continue to be able to operate in a way that they can stay in business, and still maintain the quality of their journalistic brand.
The nonprofit thing, from my point of view, is a mixed bag. It's a good thing in that, as was mentioned before, nonprofits have historically supported investigative journalism and supported holes in markets where nonprofits can play an important role, and they'll do more of that in the future. I am frustrated, however, by the reliance of many journalistic entrepreneurs, especially in local markets, thinking they can, with an NPR tin cup model or with foundation money, start local news sites that will have sustainability around them. It's really important that we get the local ad model figured out so that lots of people can be supported in sustainable business models.
Let me make one comment, if you don't mind, to the question of not-for-profit. I'm going to paraphrase. The chairman of NPR is a very, very intelligent Harvard professor who says the following. Non-for-profits are driven by a mission, and without profits, there's no mission. And what I wanted to mention is that there's three things that make a non-for-profit different. Number one, we don't have shareholders. Number two, we get a favorable tax treatment. And number three, we don't call it net profit. We call it net change in assets. Outside of that, NPR is run as any very well-run and effective media corporation should be run, because otherwise we just cannot afford what we do. Exactly. So to me, not-for-profit is a designation. It's not a state of mind. You cannot run any organization without an intent for profit.
Let's take another question, but before we take it, let me just say, don't you hate when people ask a question and then answer it themselves? I do. So, does anybody care? Look over there.
You mentioned before the need for complete redesign, and I'm wondering if you or anybody else yet has an idea of where that design should be heading.
I do, but it's a very, I could give you an hour on that. And again, it's not like I know all the answers. I think I have some good sense after the time I've spent of the trends and what that means. But I think it means everything from exploring new forms, instead of simply a reliance on long-form narrative. I think it means a very different approach to how you take and what kind of different iterations you craft out of the knowledge that you gain. When I look at some of our writers, for instance, and I say, these are the foremost experts in their areas. So why aren't they, in addition to doing that ephemeral day-to-day coverage, which is what the traditional media has obviously operated on for understandable reason, but in the world of the web is about deep resources, can accommodate deep resources. So why can't that expert in that area not just be doing the ephemeral day-to-day coverage, but building the deep resources about that subject, which also makes it much more amenable to good SEO, further use. How do you get as much shelf life value out of every bit of content you create? I mean, that's just one aspect of it.
I'll give you 3 words: standardization, automation, and agility. We saw it in the automotive industry when they transformed. We saw it in the finance industry when it transformed. We've seen it in virtually every other industry except the media industry, and we're getting closer. But until you standardize the way that you manage metadata and content and workflows, until you get much more agile in your ability to repurpose content across platforms, and until you can do it in an automated fashion so you can lower the unit cost of production, you can't compete in these new business models.
Except that what I would add to that and is what I run into and what I push back on is you'll find editorial folks in that regard say, well, we need better tools. And I say, yeah, you're right, we could have better tools. I could rewrite all of our systems and know that they will be much better 6 months from now. But that's not the right answer, because there's nothing about the technology that should hold back the creativity with the form.
Just 2 observations about that. I worked on some of this in the 90s in launching a large news website, and we haven't advanced a whole lot beyond where we were in the early part of this decade. But 2 things need to happen. One is integration, and that is meaning getting data, text, applications, and technology working well together in a seamless way that's user-friendly. We don't do a great job of that at all. And the other is iteration, and that is storytelling and story development in ways that people like Josh Marshall at Talking Points Memo do, so that the story is an ongoing, fluid thing with reader contributions helping shape the direction that certain stories go. Josh does that very well. Not too many people do it really well. There's a lot of work that'll be done about that as well.
Yeah, Josh is a great example, and a guy who started out at Salon, but he won the George Polk Award, and for his work about the U.S. attorney scandal, and there wasn't one piece longer than 600 words. And yeah, he engaged every new approach he could think of, including crowdsourcing, including having his audience help them go through Justice Department documents. Just takes a lot of cleverness, but yeah, technology can help, but it takes cleverness. And the hardest thing that you run into, and again, if I see it at Salon, that's only a shadow of what I know it is at real traditional organizations, is breaking the cultural thinking about these approaches to the medium, these approaches to workflow, is hugely difficult. In fact, I tend to think impossible.
Yes, I agree.
With that, we are going to end this panel. Thank you guys so much. You're really insightful.